In the last video, we looked at what underpins the SDGs, the moral architecture on which they're built. We tried to trace that line between the idea of rights that emerged from Locke and others, those negative rights about the right to life, the right to free speech, etc., through to the idea of dignity of the person that we get from Kant and respect, and demonstrated how they've now moved into the area of positive rights, of things that we would want everyone in the world to be able to have access to. But just because we've got a moral framework in place doesn't mean it's something that we should always follow, particularly when we're dealing with something like the area of rights. Specifically, when we're dealing with the rights developed by the UN in the SDGs, we hit three key problems. Questions of legitimacy, clarity, and coherence. Now, these critiques aren't coming from cynicism. They're coming from some very serious philosophical and institutional questions. And we need to understand them if we're going to want to take SDGs seriously. So let's look at legitimacy. The first thing to realize is that the SDGs are more than a policy list. They're actually a moral framework designed to guide global action. So what that means is they assume that everyone around the world shares common values, that this moral guidance can come from one body, the United Nations, and that these global goals can actually be translated into what you do in a local area, that they can turn into local business practice. But we've really got to examine these claims if we're going to take them seriously. Let's take the issue of where do these moral claims come from? They come from a body, a political body, the United Nations. Now, it's representing itself as the moral voice of humanity, but it's not a democracy. Of the 193 members of the United Nations, almost a third are authoritarian regimes. What's even more striking is that some of these authoritarian governments sit on the committees that oversee areas like human rights. That's kind of like putting the fox in charge of the henhouse. In fact, the entire structure of the UN is undemocratic. The permanent members of the Security Council have a veto over a lot of what goes on, giving immense power to a few nations, not something that we'd expect in a liberal democracy like Australia. Right? So it raises the entire question. When the UN tells business around the world what's ethical, we have to ask, is this really moral leadership? Or is it really a politically negotiated compromise? Now, that's not to say that there's nothing positive about the UN. What we have with the UN is procedural legitimacy. There's wide participation. And in fact, some people argue that it's really important to have nations like those with authoritarian regimes engaged, right? That's one of the ways we bring them along with us as we seek to develop some of these moral ideas globally. But having said that, just because the framework has emerged from a body with procedural legitimacy doesn't actually mean that that framework has moral substantive legitimacy. We really do have to step back and ask, is this an ethical thing that they're asking of business to do? If you want to be a good business citizen, you're going to have to step back and decide whether this guidance from the UN represents this moral truth you believe the business should follow, or whether it's just the outcome of an international political process. We need to think about it critically, not blindly. Like any human right, it suffers from the problem, what is the source of that right? Why should we believe what they're asking is a human right, particularly when we're dealing with those positive human rights? The second key problem that we've got is conceptual clarity, or more precisely, the lack of conceptual clarity around much of what is stated. Look, the SDGs are inspiring, but they're also full of what moral philosophers would call thick concepts, ideas that are morally and descriptively rich, but they're empirically very fuzzy. Take SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. Look, that sounds fantastic. Everyone wants decent work and economic growth, but what exactly counts as decent? A living wage? Safe working conditions? Local purchasing power parity? The UN doesn't specify, and that makes implementing it and accountability very hard. A second key problem with this conceptual vagueness is we don't actually know who's supposed to do what. Many of the initiatives have really complex causal chains. What do I mean by that? Well, there's lots of things that affect the SDG. Why do we think that business would be in any position to advance any specific SDG? Take, for example, a company that decides it's going to improve wages, even pay more into suppliers to try and address some of the wage problems in an international supplier. Does that really reduce global poverty? Or does it just shift value from one part of the supply chain to another? Are we taking the decent standard of living from one group and reducing it to improve the decent standard of living with another? Is that really furthering the SDG in question? And so the fluidity and the interpretability of all of these terms involved in large-scale moral ideas mean the entire area is open to manipulation, so-called greenwashing, where you selectively report and exaggerate your impact claims. I think some people call it sustainability theatre, all because we can't really define what we mean by things like fair income, safe conditions, dignity, sustainability. They're inspiring terms, but they lack conceptual clarity. From a quite simple perspective, we don't have an agreed definition of what success looks like around the SDGs. And that means almost any business can claim alignment with them, even when their contributions are negligible and superficial. The final major critique we're going to talk about is this real problem of goal conflict and fragmentation. There's a lack of coherence in the framework as it's presented. Look, the SDGs are a fantastic, inspirational set of things we might really want to try and achieve, but they don't hang together logically all the time. For instance, SDG 8 calls for sustained economic growth and full employment, while SDG 13 demands rapid emissions reduction. Those two goals are often going to come into direct conflict. The more we produce, the more we're going to emit. And it's not just economic and environmental conflicts. Renewable energy projects that achieve SDG 7, clean energy, can disrupt communities, SDG 11, or harm ecosystems, SDG 14. And the overarching framework, the SDGs themselves, don't offer any kind of hierarchy or sense of how to resolve these trade-offs. So what you end up with is each business and each country decides for itself which goals to prioritize. At the end of the day, we might not be achieving anything, and we might all be actually rowing the boat in quite different directions, which is beyond being inconsistent. It actually can lead to cynicism. Why is that? Well, in practice, one company's sustainability win is seen by another company as an ethical compromise. They wouldn't have made that trade-off. And because the SDG framework lacks any way to rank or prioritize these conflicts, there's contradictions, and those contradictions get managed politically, not philosophically. What we end up with is a lot of bright, glossy brochures reporting what we're doing, but not much evidence that it's all moving in the same direction, because we know what to do when these particular values collide. So, to bring us back, we have three core critiques to keep in mind when we're thinking about the SDGs and whether we should even implement them. Number one, the UN's legitimacy problem. Why do they get to decide what's moral, what we should do? Two, the conceptual vagueness problem. How do we measure success? How do we know that we're actually achieving any of the SDGs, given the language that's used? Three, the coherence problem. What are we going to do when goals conflict? How do we know how to make trade-offs that are going to occur? Look, these problems aren't just part of an ivory tower or academic debate. They explain why implementing the SDGs in business is often messier than what all of those marketing brochures suggest. In the next video, we're going to use a hypothetical to see what happens when these tensions come together and a company actually has to make these kinds of decisions. So I'll see you in the next video.